Welcome to Vivid Verses. If our words resonate with you, please subscribe, tap the like, and share your thoughts and your feelings in the comments. Now, let's begin. The blueprint for the sterling restoration was splayed across my drafting table like a map of a life I was slowly, meticulously dismantling. I traced the line of a load-bearing wall with a graphite pencil, the lead leaving a dark, decisive mark on the vellum. Architecture, at its core, was never about the marble or the glass. It was about the physics of burden. It was about knowing exactly how much pressure a structure could endure before the first microscopic fractures appeared in the foundation. I had spent 15 years calculating stress points in steel and stone, and for the last 6 months, I have been doing the same to my marriage. My name is Julian Thorne. In the city of Ethelgard, my name was synonymous with structural integrity. I built the things that stayed upright when the wind howled. My office was a sanctuary of high ceilings and shadow, smelling of espresso and the ozone of a high-end plotter. Across from me, Marcus, my business partner and a man who treated vintage watches with more tenderness than most people treated their children, was hunched over a 19th century Breguet. Marcus was a man of the microscopic. While I built the skyline, he fixed the seconds. He was currently trying to repair a hairspring that looked like a strand of spider silk. "You're thickening the support columns on the west wing again, Julian," Marcus noted, his voice muffled by the jeweler's loop pressed into his eye socket. "Expecting a hurricane in the suburbs?" "The soil report came back," I said, my voice level, devoid of the tremor that used to be there. "The ground in Oak Ridge is shifting. If I don't reinforce the base now, the whole thing will slide into the ravine within 5 years. I don't build things that slide." Marcus finally looked up, his eye magnified and strange through the glass. "We still talking about the Sterling project, or are we talking about the fact that Lorrie tried to accidentally liquidate your shared brokerage account at 4 p.m. yesterday?" I didn't flinch. I had known about the liquidation attempt within 3 minutes of the phone call from my broker, a man named Henderson who owed me a favor from a development deal back in 2018. "She's testing the perimeter, Marcus," I said, tapping my pencil against the mahogany table, "seeing where the fences are electrified. She thinks I'm still the man who apologizes for the weather. She's not just testing, Julian. She's actively sabotaging. You're too patient. If my ex-wife had tried to reroute the Mercer contract funds, I would have had her in front of a judge before the ink was dry on the transfer. Patience isn't weakness, Marcus. It's a strategy. You don't move until the structural survey is complete. Otherwise, you're just screaming at a falling building." I turned back to the plans. I wasn't a pushover. Not anymore. I was an architect, and I was currently designing the most complex, legally sound exit strategy of my life. The disrespect hadn't started with a bang. It had started with a slow, corrosive drip like salt air on an unprotected girder. 5 years ago, Lorrie had been my greatest champion. She was an art consultant with a sharp eye for the avant-garde and a laugh that could cut through a crowded room. But as my firm, Thor & Associates, began to dominate the high-end market, something in her shifted. Success, it seemed, didn't breed pride in her. It bred a toxic, simmering resentment. It began with small, domestic humiliations. She would interrupt me at dinner parties, events I paid for, in a house I designed, to correct a story I was telling. She would roll her eyes when I discussed the engineering challenges of a new build, calling my passion pedantic or boring. Then it escalated. She began making major household decisions without me, hiring contractors to tear up parts of the house I had designed, replacing the minimalist aesthetic I loved with gaudy, expensive statements. "Oh, Julian, don't be so precious," she'd say in front of the neighbors, her voice dripping with a performative sweetness that felt like a razor blade. "You're an architect, not a god. This kitchen was a mausoleum. I'm giving it life. Try to keep up, darling. I had watched her, noted the tone, and waited. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply began to observe her the way I would observe a building with a failing joist. The real discovery, the moment the diagnosis moved from unstable to condemned, happened on a Tuesday in late autumn. I had returned home early because a site inspection in the waterfront district had been postponed due to a crane malfunction. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy. Lorrie's SUV was in the driveway, but she wasn't alone. A silver Jaguar, low, aggressive, and expensive, was idling at the curb. I knew that car. It belonged to Arthur Beaumont, a rival developer who had a history of predatory acquisitions, both in business and in private life. I didn't enter through the front. I went through the side entrance of the detached garage, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew every joint and squeak in the floorboards. I found her in the sunroom. The glass doors cracked just enough for her voice to carry. "He's so predictable, Arthur," she was saying. I could hear the clink of a wine glass against stone. Her voice was laced with a mockery I'd never heard directed at anyone else. "He spends his life worrying about structural integrity while I'm slowly emptying the coffers. By the time he realizes the accounts are bleeding, I'll have enough to start the gallery in London. He'll be left with his blueprints and his silence." Beaumont's voice, deep and oily, replied, "And the Mercer Trust? You're sure he hasn't noticed the draws? That's a lot of capital to move under the nose of a man who counts every brick." "Julian?" Lorrie laughed, a dry, jarring sound. "He's too busy playing with his CAD software. He thinks I'm buying antique rugs for the foyer. He doesn't check the line items. He checks the total. As long as the total looks reasonable, he stays in his little bubble of self-importance. He's a pushover, Arthur. I've spent 10 years training him to stay in his lane." I stood in the shadows of the hallway, feeling a strange, cold clarity. It wasn't the searing pain of a broken heart. It was the clinical satisfaction of a theory proven. The building wasn't just leaning. The foundation was fraudulent. Over the next 3 months, my life became a series of dualities. By day, I was the prestigious architect, closing deals and reviewing site plans. By night, I was a ghost in my own home, a silent observer of my wife's descent into arrogance. Marcus was my only confidant, though his advice was usually colored by his own bitter divorce. He spent his lunches at the office, trying to convince me to go scorched earth. "You have the evidence, Julian," Marcus said one afternoon, meticulously cleaning a set of gears. "The PI reports, the bank logs, the photos of her in Beaumont at that boutique hotel in the city. Why are you still eating dinner with her? Why are you still letting her drive your cars?" "Because, Marcus, if you demolish a building too early, you risk damaging the surrounding structures," I said, sipping a lukewarm coffee. "I'm waiting for the permit." The permit was my lawyer, Benedict. He was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of salt, weathered, hard, and essential. Benedict didn't do noisy divorces. He did surgical ones. "We're moving the assets into the Thorne Family Trust," Benedict had explained in our first meeting. "Since the initial corpus was funded by your grandfather's inheritance, we can legally silo it. But we have to do it slowly. If you move $5 million overnight, it looks like concealment. If you move $50,000 a week into capital improvements for the firm, it's just business as usual." I had also initiated what Benedict called the shadow audit. I hired a specialist named Silas, a digital forensic expert who looked like a bored college student but could trace a wire transfer through 6 tax havens in his sleep. Silas discovered that Lorrie wasn't just buying rugs. She was investing in a shell company, Apex Acquisitions, which was a front for Beaumont's latest hostile takeover bid of a historical district. She was literally funding the man who was trying to put my firm out of business. The disrespect to home, meanwhile, reached a fever pitch. We were hosting a charity gala for the Ethelgard Arts Council, a required event that Lorrie had insisted upon. The house was filled with the city's elite, people I had built for, people I had known for decades. Lorrie stood by the fireplace, wearing a dress that cost more than a modest sedan, holding court. I walked over to offer her a fresh drink, and she didn't even turn around. "Oh, here's Julian," she said to the circle of donors, her voice loud enough to carry. "The man who can tell you the exact tensile strength of a steel cable, but can't pick out a tie that matches his socks." Honestly, if I didn't manage his life, he'd still be living in a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor. The circle chuckled, that polite, uncomfortable laugh of people who know they're witnessing a cruelty but don't want to lose their place at the bar. "Actually, Lorrie," I said, my voice calm, projecting with the authority I used on construction sites. The studio apartment had better acoustics, and the mattress was far more honest than the furniture we have now. The laughter stopped instantly. Lorrie's eyes flashed with a cold, sharp rage. She hadn't expected me to speak, let alone hit back. "Go check on the catering, Julian," she snapped. "You're clearly tired." I smiled at her, a genuine, chilling smile. I've never been more awake. Sarah Sterling was the wild card in the deck. She was Lorrie's best friend from their university days, but they were as different as a stone cathedral and a glass skyscraper. Sarah was a billionaire in her own right, a tech pioneer who had sold her first company at 26 and spent her days investing in high-risk startups and her weekends racing vintage Porsches of the Nürburgring. Sarah and I had always shared a quiet, unspoken understanding. We were both builders. She built systems, I built spaces. A week before the keys incident, Sarah cornered me in the lobby of the firm. She was dressed in a tailored racing suit, her helmet under one arm. "Julian," she said, her voice like gravel and velvet, "you're looking thin, and your eyes look like you haven't slept since the Mercer contract closed." "Occupational hazard, Sarah," I said, trying to push past her. She stepped in my path. "Don't bullshit me. I've seen how Lorrie treats you. I've seen the way she looks at Beaumont when she thinks no one is watching. She's a predator, Julian, and she thinks you're the prey." "I'm not prey, Sarah. I'm just waiting." She leaned in, her eyes sharp. "Waiting for what? The roof to cave in?" "My father used to say that you don't wait for the storm to pass. You learn to drive through it. If you need a lawyer who isn't Benedict, someone who will actually draw blood, I have a guy in Zurich. And if you need to get out of that house, I have a car that can outrun anything in Lorrie's garage. I appreciate the offer, Sarah, but I have Benedict, and I have a plan. Just don't wait too long," she warned, tapping the side of her helmet. "The longer you stay in a collapsing building, the more likely you are to get pinned under the rubble. Lorrie isn't just leaving you, Julian. She's trying to erase you." "She could try," I said, "but she'll find that I'm built into the very bones of this city. You can't erase an architect without tearing down the skyline." Sarah grinned, a fierce, predatory thing. "I like that. Give me a call when you're ready to drive." The morning of the explosion began with a deceptive, heavy stillness. I woke up at 5 a.m. I spent an hour in my home office, which I had recently moved to the detached guest wing. I reviewed the final documents Silas had sent over. The Thorn Trust was now fully insulated. The Mercer contract, the jewel of my firm's crown, had been legally restructured into a subsidiary that Lorrie had no claim to, thanks to a performance clause she hadn't bothered to read when she'd insisted on being named a silent partner. I was ready. The structural reinforcement was complete. Now I just needed the catalyst. I walked into the main kitchen at 7:30 a.m. Lorrie was already there, dressed in a sharp, blood-red power suit. She looked like she was ready for a hostile takeover. There was a manic energy about her, a sharp-edged triumph in the way she held her espresso cup. "I'm taking the Range Rover today," she said, not looking at me. I have a gallery opening in the city, and I need the space for some crates. That's fine, I said, leaning against the marble island. I'll take the Audi. I have a meeting with the historic board at 10. Lorrie turned, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out 2 sets of keys. My Audi keys and the spares. Actually, no, you won't, she said. Her voice was cold, vibrating with a decade of suppressed resentment. I've decided the Audi needs a full detailing, and the garage door is acting up, so I've had the locksmith come by this morning to change the codes. You're not going anywhere, Julian. I didn't move. Lorrie, don't play games. I have a firm to run. That meeting is about the city library project. Oh, I think the city will survive without you for one day, she spat. She walked closer, her perfume, something expensive and cloying, filling the space between us. You're so obsessed with your little structures, Julian. So convinced that you're the one in control. Well, look at you now. You're trapped in a house you built. You want to go out? You want to be the big, important architect? Walk. Walk if you want to go out. Julian, see how much your structural integrity is worth when you're sweating on the sidewalk like a common laborer. She jangled the keys in my face, a gesture of such profound, petty disrespect that it felt like a physical blow. You're making a mistake, Lorrie, I said, my voice dropping into a register I usually reserve for contractors who try to cut corners on safety. A very expensive one. The only mistake I made was thinking you were a man worth staying with, she hissed. You're a shell, Julian. A boring, predictable shell. Arthur says you're the past. He's the future, and I'm going with him. She turned on her heel, her red heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. She marched out the front door, slamming it with enough force to rattle the chandelier. A moment later, I heard the Range Rover roar to life and scream down the driveway. I stood in the kitchen. I didn't rage. I didn't chase after her. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply picked up my phone and sent a one-word text to Sarah Sterling. Now. Then I called Benedict. File the papers. All of them. And call the precinct. Report the Audi as a restricted asset being withheld during a legal dispute. Give them the GPS coordinates. I've already activated the tracker. I walked out onto the front porch. The morning air was crisp, tasting of salt and turning leaves. I sat on the top step, checked my watch, and waited. 5 minutes passed. The suburban silence of Oak Ridge was broken by a sound that felt like a physical weight, the high-pitched mechanical scream of a flat-six engine. The metallic blue Porsche 911 Turbo S rounded the corner like a predator that had finally been let off its leash. It didn't slow down for the speed bumps. It crested them with a grace that was almost insulting to the neighbors. Sarah pulled into the driveway, the tires chirping as she brought the car to a halt exactly 3 inches from the edge of my manicured lawn. She killed the engine. The silence that followed was thick, charged with the smell of hot rubber and high-octane fuel. Sarah stepped out of the car, wearing a leather driving jacket and dark aviators. She looked at me, sitting on the porch, and let out a short, sharp laugh. "Nice morning for a walk, Julian," she said, leaning against the fender. "But I think a drive will be better. You look like you've finally reached the end of your patient strategy." She took the keys, Sarah, told me to walk. I know. I saw her at the light. She looked like she'd just won the lottery. Sarah walked up the steps and stood beside me. She looked at the house, the colonial-style masterpiece I had poured 3 years of my life into. "It's a beautiful building, Julian, but the air in here is toxic. You ready to go? I have a meeting at 10. I'll get you there by 9:30. And I might take the bridge route, just so we can hear the engine echo." At that moment, the Range Rover reappeared at the end of the street. Lorrie had forgotten her briefcase, the one containing the gallery plans that Silas had already confirmed were actually the blueprints for Beaumont's theft of my intellectual property. She screeched into the driveway, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury as she saw Sarah standing on our porch. She slammed the SUV into park and scrambled out, her heels clicking frantically on the stone. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing here?" she screamed. "And why's your car in my driveway? Get away from my husband." Sarah didn't even flinch. She didn't look at Lorrie. She kept her eyes on me. "Ready, Julian? The leather is heated, and I have a bottle of something very expensive in the back for when the sun goes down. Julian, get inside right now." Lorrie shrieked, her voice hitting a frantic, ugly pitch. "Sarah, get off my property before I call the police." I stood up. I felt taller than I had in years. I looked at Lorrie, really looked at her. I saw the blotchy red of her skin, the desperation behind the rage, the smallness of her ambition. "The police are already on their way, Lorrie," I said. "But they're not coming for Sarah. They're coming for the Audi. And they're coming to serve you with a restraining order regarding the firm's assets." Lorrie's face went from red to a ghostly, translucent white. What are you talking about?" "The Thor Trust is locked, Lorrie. The Mercer contract has been siloed. And the money you've been funneling to Arthur Beaumont? Silas has the paper trail. Every wire transfer, every shell company, every antique rug that turned into a stock option for Apex Acquisitions." I walked down the steps, past my wife, who was now shaking with a combination of fear and realization. I walked straight to the Porsche. "You're a coward," Lorrie screamed, her voice breaking. "You're running away with my best friend? After everything I did for you? You're a pathetic, boring little man." I paused with my hand on the door handle. I turned to look at her one last time. "You didn't do anything for me, Lorrie," I said quietly. "You did everything to me. You thought I was a pushover because I didn't scream. But an architect doesn't scream at a building when it starts to fail. He simply deconstructs it." I slid into the passenger seat. The interior of the 911 was a cockpit of precision, brushed aluminum, carbon fiber, and the scent of fine machinery. "Need a ride?" Sarah asked, her hand resting on the gear shift. Her eyes were bright with a fierce, contagious joy. I actually enjoy having a real man in my passenger seat. Someone who knows that speed is only good if you have a solid foundation. "Drive," I said. Sarah floored the accelerator. The G-force pressed me back into the seat, a sensation of sudden, violent freedom. I saw Lorrie in the side mirror, a small, diminishing figure screaming in the middle of the driveway, shaking her fists at the sky. She looked insignificant. She looked like a mistake I'd finally corrected. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in controlled demolition. Lorrie tried every trick in the book. She tried to claim the trust was a fraudulent conveyance. She tried to sue Sarah for alienation of affection. She even tried to go to the local news with a story about a betrayed wife. But the press didn't care for a story where the wife had been caught on camera entering the Beaumont Hotel with her husband's biggest rival. Benedict was relentless. Every time her lawyer tried to make a move, Benedict was there with a countersuit, a forensic audit, or a witness statement from one of the contractors she'd tried to suborn. In the end, she had no leverage. She signed the settlement papers in a windowless room in Benedict's office, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She walked away with the Range Rover, which I'd already paid off, her personal jewelry, and a lump sum that was exactly 10% of what she thought she'd get. I kept the firm. I kept the Thorn Trust. I kept my dignity. I didn't stay in Oak Ridge. I sold the house to a young tech couple who appreciated the minimalist mausoleum aesthetic. I moved into a loft in the city, a space of exposed brick, high ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the skyline I had helped build. Marcus was there on the day I moved in, helping me unpack a crate of architectural models. "You know," Marcus said, carefully placing a model of the Ethelgard Library on a pedestal, The Brigade is finally keeping perfect time. It just needed a new mainspring. The old one was snapped. Sometimes you have to replace the heart of the machine to make it work again. Marcus. True. He looked at me, his magnifying loupe swinging around his neck. So, are you going to tell me what's going on with you and Sarah? She's been dropping by the office a lot lately to discuss the garage layout for her new project. She's a client, Marcus. She's a client who drives a car that costs more than my house and looks at you like you're the last honest man in Ethelgard. Don't be a fool twice, Julian. I'm not a fool, I said, looking out at the city. I'm just enjoying the view. The door to the loft opened. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The scent of citrus and the confident click of boots on the polished concrete gave her away. The Porsche is downstairs, Sarah said, leaning against the support column. I found a little place 4 hours north. No cell service, no blueprints, and they serve the best lobster rolls on the Atlantic. You interested, or are you still obsessing over the load-bearing capacity of that brick wall? I turned and looked at her. She was wearing a simple sundress, her hair wind-blown and free. She looked like the future, not a future designed by committee or dictated by resentment, but a future built on mutual respect and shared speed. I'm not sure I can handle 4 hours of your driving, Sarah. My back is still recovering from the bridge route. She laughed, a sound that finally filled the empty spaces in the loft. Fine, we'll take your Audi, but I'm driving. I reached for my keys, the new ones, on a simple titanium ring. I walked over and tossed them to her. She caught them with one hand, her eyes sparkling. You're learning, Thorne, she said. I'm an architect, Sarah, I said, taking her hand as we walked toward the elevator. I know a solid foundation when I see one. We descended to the street, leaving the ghosts of Oak Ridge and the bitterness of the past in the rearview mirror. The ride had been long, and the road had been rocky, but as the engine roared to life, I knew one thing for certain. Some rides end, but the best ones? They're the ones where you finally know exactly where you're going, and you're with the only person who can keep up with the pace. Thank you for listening. That brings today's story to a close. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. See you next time.